Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so much for tuning into the show this week. Hello, E.C. How are you?
Hey, great. How are you?
Wondrous. We're going to talk about everybody's favorite subject, fasting. We're going to talk about fasting, what it really means, how it impacts weight loss, and whether it delivers on promises of better health and performance. So, where the heck should we begin?
Well, we did an episode in December 2021.
Yeah, so I'm sure everybody remembers.
Everyone remembers. Time flies when you're having fun. Yeah, so I don't know, 3.5, 4 years later, maybe we revisit this. Maybe there's been some new research, see what's changed. And yeah, to take a look at the kind of the outcomes that everyone has interest in, which you just already mentioned. But yeah, I think two things that make fasting really confusing for people when you see kind of different headlines or whatever stuff on social media is, first of all, these outcomes that we mentioned that we want, whether or not that's weight, health, or performance, they do really have quantitative nutrition endpoints. Meaning, to lose weight, there's a certain number of calories you need to hit. Or for performance, to make sure that you're going to fuel properly for competition, there's going to be a certain number of calories for that. Or even maybe break it down further, a certain amount of carb grams you want to be optimally fueled for. To increase muscle mass, which we talk about all the time, there's going to be a certain amount of protein grams that you need to have. For health, there's a certain amount of potassium you need every day, right? It's all of these things, there's a certain amount of these nutrients you need for these outcomes, and fasting doesn't track any of that. Fasting is about not eating at certain times. And I will tell you that there are some people who are fasting who are hitting the right amounts that I just mentioned, and then there are people who are fasting and they're not hitting the right amount for their goals. You know, you can take two people who fast, let's say they only eat between the hours of noon and 8 p.m. every day, and one person within those 8 hours, they weigh and measure their foods, they get their fruits and veggies, they make sure they get their protein, they hit the right number of calories, right? And then the other person, it's just more of a free-for-all. It's McDonald's, it's ice cream, it's donuts, all of that stuff. We know that their outcomes are going to be very different. So fasting is a really loose system for nutrition. It doesn't actually control the variables that control the outcomes you want. It's much more by chance, or if you bring intention to the time period at which you're eating by knowing I have to get this much protein or I have to get this many calories, that you're going to get your goals with fasting. Now, this is true in fasting's defense. This is true with a lot of diets. If you go low carb, you aren't controlling total calories. If you go low carb, you aren't controlling your protein grams. But the point is, it's a really loose system. It's like a lot of diets, and it explains why we have so many variable results. Like, people wonder, why does fasting work for my friend and not for me? And it's because, well, they just happened to hit the right number of nutrients for their goals and you didn't. I do think fasting's another level removed, though, from something like the 800-gram challenge or counting calories, because it doesn't address food at all. It just says times, where at least other diets are like talking about food choices to some degree, right?
Yep.
So that's one big thing about fasting that I think is confusing. I think the other thing that's confusing about fasting is there's so many different protocols that are recommended. You know, there's like the simple overnight fast, which is what I did for years, where you might stop eating at 7 p.m. and you don't start till 11 or 12 the next day. It's like 15, 16 hours of fasting. Yep. But then there's stuff where people do every other day fasting, where they eat for 24 hours, although they sleep at some point, and then they don't eat for 24 hours. Then there's these quasi-fast. One that's gotten really popular is the 5-2 method, where 2 of the 7 days per week, it's like a fasting day, but it's not a total fasting day. You only eat about 500 calories those days. So I think what happens is people get really lost in these protocols. Like, oh my gosh, maybe I'm going to have a much better result with every other day fasting than the 5-2 protocol, without realizing that at the end of the day, let's say if they're after weight loss, that whatever one allowed them to reduce calories consistently is what drove it. Not that the 5-2 is so magical, or not that the every other day is so magical. So I think that adds another layer of confusion as people get lost in the how-to versus seeing what's driving the outcome they want.
Okay, so we did this originally, we talked about this originally in 2021, so this is going to be a bit of an update of that conversation. Of course, we're going to go through a lot of it because we assume that most people don't remember it. Before we get into it, do you get a sense, because you pay attention to this way more than I do you get the sense that the general belief in fasting has increased since 2020 when we first talked about this, or has it decreased? Some other things have sort of taken the oxygen out of the conversation, and fasting has fallen away. Do you have any sense of where it still is in sort of the cultural zeitgeist of nutrition?
I feel like it's probably decreased. I've probably gotten more questions related to like animal based or super high protein. I mean, oh my God, that feels like we're just in a never ending onslaught of protein. But I do still definitely get questions about it, or in conversations with people, you realize that fasting is being laid on to their nutrition paradigm.
Yep.
A lot of times I end up hearing it specifically related to, well, I'm having a hard time hitting the nutrition goals because I don't eat breakfast. And then it's like, well, why are you not eating breakfast? You know, and so it kind of is one of those things that I think it still gets layered on often, even though I probably don't get quite as many questions about it directly.
Got it. Okay. So let us jump in then. Let's talk about weight loss or body comp improvements. Anything that the research, anything you've come across since our original episode worth mentioning in that regard?
Yeah, there has been some new research. I don't know that my opinions change much. You know, weight loss, again, happens if you are in a caloric deficit. Now, I do think what's interesting with research and things like fasting is generally when people say that they're doing intermittent fasting, it's more implied that they are achieving a caloric deficit. It's more implied that they're doing it for weight loss. And then there's terms like time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating, which that's supposed to generally imply that the person is eating the right amount of calories to maintain their weight, but they've just shortened the window. But what's interesting about both of those is that's just sort of implied, or maybe the intent, but we don't actually know that's happening. Because to instill or to ensure that we're having a caloric deficit or that we're having a caloric maintenance, we'd actually have to count calories, right? So we'd actually have to look at the person's body weight to establish whether or not they're doing intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding or any of that stuff. But yeah, at the end of the day, what we find are the results are the same. The Shore 2020 paper in the show notes, it's a systematic review and meta-analysis. We love these of our randomized controlled trials looking at adults who were either fasting or cutting calories. And lo and behold, the changes in weight and fat mass were comparable between them. I think what's interesting from this paper, though, is something potentially troubling for the fasting contingent, in that lean mass decreased more for those individuals who were fasting than for those who were cutting calories. So muscle mass decreased for people that were fasting more. This is, though, a little bit at odds with another 2024 paper I found, the Conde Pippo's paper in the show notes, that concluded intermittent fasting helped retain muscle mass. Again, this is a place where I feel like from a layperson perspective, it could get very confusing. It's like, oh my God, look, the science is always finding different stuff. One says it's bad for lean mass. The other one says it's good for lean mass. And when you dive in deeper to understand who they were looking at, you understand why the difference probably occurred. That second paper, they were really looking at athletes. And so when we're looking at athletes, what are they doing? They're exercising more regularly, which is going to help retain lean mass. And they're also going to be a more educated population about protein and probably a little bit more keyed into eating protein, right? So it's less so, in my opinion, that intermittent fasting is bad for lean mass. It's more that, okay, if we cut calories and we don't eat enough protein, we're probably going to lose lean mass on an intermittent fasting plan. And that if you are going to want to do this and you want to keep your muscle mass, you still have to be keyed into how much protein am I getting in my window, not just sort of be like, oh, I'm just looking at the clock and the hours that I'm eating.
Got it. Okay. What about, so that was weight loss or body comp. What about health and longevity? What have you seen, or what can we update from our original conversation?
Yeah, of course, if fasting helps somebody lose weight and they get into that healthy weight range, that's how we're going to help health and longevity. You know, I know we've talked about this a lot recently, it feels like, but the excess weight is a big driver for inflammation. So that can be a driver for heart disease or Alzheimer's or cancer. Not all cases, but that can be a contributing factor for them. And so if intermittent fasting is a successful way that people cut calories, then sure, it's going to pay off in their health and longevity. Now, the James paper from 2024 in the show notes, this is really what's known as a scoping review, meaning they're not done their research, they're starting to look at the research, but they were pulling together randomized controlled trials on fasting versus cutting calories with regards to aging outcomes. And so far, they basically conclude that they are equivalently effective across cardiometabolic, cancer, and neurocognitive outcomes, meaning no difference, again, between cutting calories and intermittent fasting. So there's not this like kind of superior health benefit to fasting. Now, one of the things that we talked about in the last episode was all of these studies related to longevity and increasing lifespan with severe caloric restriction, and how we've seen that in some of the mice trials. And I think one of the things that I want to relate or restate about those that it's really important to kind of put it in context is the level of caloric restriction that you would have to do to recreate those mice trials, assuming that we're going to follow the fate of mice, which is another big if, but whatever. If we want to say that we have to follow what they're doing to extend our life to that degree, it's a huge caloric deficit. It's 30% of your maintenance. That's huge. And to think that somebody could do that type of caloric deficit in a modern food environment to try to reach, let's say, 120 years old, I think is so out of touch with what would actually happen in real life. I think, again, it's one of those ideas that theoretically might work in animal models, but practically won't actually happen with real free-living humans. And I think the other thing that people overlook with this idea of severe caloric restriction is going to extend your life based on animal models is that those animal models, they're living in germ-free cages. They're not exposed to the same stressors that we are, again, in kind of a free-living world. And that 30% of a caloric deficit for years and decades is ultimately very likely going to result in some nutrient deficiency. You're very likely not going to have enough calcium. You're very likely not going to have enough vitamin A, which works out just fine if you're in, I don't know, a 10 by 12 cage. I don't really know how big mice cages are.
Yep.
Doesn't work so well when you have to get up and down stairs. Doesn't work so well when you're exposed to viruses, right? Like you need that calcium for strong bones. You need that vitamin A for your immune system. And so this idea that like a caloric deficit is really going to be the model to follow, severe caloric deficit above and beyond achieving a healthy weight is going to be the model to follow for longevity, I think is really out of touch, again, between like what's theoretically possible in a lab versus what's needed in real life. And then I do also want to kind of touch on, we talked about it in our Blue Zone podcast, that longevity is not just about diet. That, yeah, it's also exercise, but yeah, it's also purpose and community and mood and outlook and all of these other things. So I think people are much better off focusing on finding the diet that allows them to get into a healthy weight range and then not worrying about this severe caloric restriction for longevity and instead focus that energy into something like community or purpose, like I just mentioned. I also just kind of one more tangent because I was looking for updated research. I did come across a study from April 2025 looking at the effects of fasting on sleep, and sleep is always of interest to me for health.
Yep.
And they found that fasting didn't really have any effects on sleep, so we can't even make the connection there that, okay, now for fasting we're sleeping better and therefore it's going to pay off in health. So a big nothing burger, a big nothing burger for fasting, really helping health and longevity above and beyond the potential that it could help somebody get into a healthy weight range.
Yep, got it. Which, as you pointed out, is the secret to longevity.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so weight loss, health, longevity. Last one that we always like to talk about is performance. Anything worth mentioning as it relates to fasting and its effect on performance?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think my opinion's changed much. It's interesting, I feel like we hear all the time how much new research there is and how much new science that is, and I really have to catch myself. Am I just being closed-minded? But I don't. Like, there's so many of the stuff that comes out and you're like, yeah, this is kind of consistent with what we knew and believed before. But yeah, generally speaking, under-eating is not how to fuel elite performance.
Check.
So that continues to be my opinion. Now, the kind of nuance or the rub here is if fasting allows someone to improve their body composition, maybe they overall reduce their calories, but they keep their protein high enough, as what the earlier paper I mentioned said that was looking at athletes, then maybe it does help performance because then they have a better strength to body weight ratio. They have a better body composition. But we have to understand that what was driving it was like, okay, a little bit less on the fat mass and that they kept their lean mass around, right? That paper that was looking at performance does mention that fasting during Ramadan really didn't help better performance. That was kind of more of this shorter studies. And there's been a lot of work done around fasting in Ramadan for obvious reasons, but it's an entire month of fasting. And so I would imagine from a performance perspective, once you accumulate 30, let's say, days in a row of fasting between sunup and sundown, or sundown and sunup, that you might start to accumulate too much of a caloric deficit from a performance perspective. And that's probably why it starts to eat away at performance once we look at something so continuous and for such a long period of time versus, let's say, a more intermittent approach where maybe people do it a few times a week or something like that. So really you want to think about optimal performance is going to be about optimal fueling. And so prioritizing fasting when to eat is not a way to ensure optimal fueling. If you really want to overlay it on top of the right quantity that you've established, you might be able to get away with it, especially something like one of the 16-8 schedules, which is where you, let's say, eat between the hours of 12 and 8 each day, but you're not going to be successful with high-end performance doing something like an every other day fasting where you're trying to fit it all in 24 hours and then skip 24 hours because you need to keep working out, right? And so that's where the focus needs to be on performance, is making sure that you are fueling the outcome appropriately. In some cases, you might need to lose mass because to optimize your body composition, optimize your strength to body weight ratio. But for a lot of athletes, it's more about making sure you're getting enough fuel than worrying about what times am I eating.
Got it. We've mentioned this, I think, before. We've talked about the notion of fat burning when fasted. In other words, doing workouts when fasted to increase fat burn. Anything to that? Anything worth mentioning on that?
Yeah, that's probably more of the question I get related to performance. It's less about, am I going to get my optimal marathon time when I'm fasted? No. And more about, am I going to get a better body composition by working out fasted, right? The answer is still most likely no. Now, where this whole idea about fat burning comes from, and again, there's some half-truths here, the body's really resilient. It's going to use what fuel you have on hand. And your storage of carbs is more limited than your storage of fat. And so carbs are going to be used up more readily throughout the day. And if you haven't eaten in a while, you're going to have more of that fat storage around for your workout. And so when you're working out fasted, you rely more on that fat storage to power the workout than carbs. And so what happens during that workout when fasted, yes, the percentage of energy that's produced from fat is going to be higher than the percentage of energy produced from carbs. So yes, you burned fat more during that workout, which sounds so great. The problem is it doesn't take into account what you eat in the entire day. So it doesn't take into account the total relative fat burned during the workout versus fat intake during the day. If you burn 200 calories of fat during the workout, but you eat 1,000 calories of fat after the workout, we are not resulting in any net fat loss. And so people will focus on this detail. It's kind of like the insulin spiking. They'll focus on this one time point in the day without seeing the entire picture. They won't see the total amount consumed during the day. So fat burning during a workout does not guarantee that you're going to lose weight or lose fat. The other problem with focusing on fat burning from this body composition perspective is that in many workout scenarios, you want the carbs so that you can work out at higher intensity. Carbs allow us to produce energy more quickly. They allow us to get closer to our maximum output that we can sustain. And if you try to do it just on fat, you won't produce the same levels of power. So from the perspective of like, okay, I want to go into the workout to challenge myself and to develop more muscular stamina or to build bigger muscles, you're going to want the carbs so that you can reach the intensities that are going to allow you to do that. And that's actually probably going to pay off more so in the long term, both in terms of burning calories in that session, but also in terms of changing your body composition long term when you do enough sessions back to back like that. And so this whole focus on trying to burn fat in any one workout is really misguided. And I would even say it's shooting yourself in the foot because you're not giving yourself the fuel to really push yourself during the workout, which is where the value is.
Yeah, I got it. All right, maybe do a quick wrap up on fasting before we get out of here.
Yeah, it probably doesn't sound like it, but I do have a love-hate relationship with it. Like, I appreciate how simple it would be.
Yeah.
Right? Like, let's not focus on what to eat and let's not count all this stuff. And why do I have to track all this? Like, believe me, I totally get it that if we could just say eat between these hours and it simplifies nutrition, I totally get it. And so I still appreciate that it can work for people. I think my wrap-up points would be, don't fall for the gimmicks. Don't fall for the idea that this is some new and different way of cutting calories or that it's going to give you some additional benefit above and beyond that. Like, it's really important for you to find the sustainable way to maintain a healthy weight. And if that's fasting, great. But if you've done fasting for 3+ weeks consistently and you're not seeing the scale go in the direction that you want it to go, okay, that's not your solution. You need something else, right? So don't fall for the gimmicks that it's doing something special. Second, long-term health is not just about your diet. I think, I guess Brian Johnson will maybe prove me wrong. The guy doing all the experiments. But I think people who really have kind of this long, high quality of life are focused on things above and beyond their diet, let alone trying to do some severe caloric restriction, right? So long-term health isn't just about your diet. And then finally, performance is really about optimal fueling. And it could be, for some people, a reduced amount of fueling to optimize that strength to body weight ratio. But for people that already have optimized their strength to body weight ratio, that already have their optimum body composition, it's more about making sure you're getting enough than worrying about cutting times off the clock that which you can eat.
Got it. Is there a person, or maybe a person who's in a specific scenario where fasting would be something you'd recommend? Or is it always, do you look at it like, I'm not going to recommend it, but if you come to me and say, hey, this has been working for me, I'll grant the premise. Is there anybody like in a specific scenario where you're like, I would maybe not start there, but I would recommend that fasting be part of whatever the overall protocol might be?
Often, if people travel a lot, if people have a lot of work client dinners and they know that they have these higher calorie outings, and then maybe the next day they're getting on a flight, maybe it's like, okay, I skip breakfast or something like that. I think that's one of the best places, especially also because travel, it's harder to find healthy foods. So it's just sort of like, okay, we're going to just take the fact that we're probably overeating at some point during this trip, and now we're going to undereat as well during some point in this trip, and hopefully we get back to balance. I will say one of the big reasons why I don't end up recommending it, and we've talked about this before, there's like a national weight loss control registry or something like that. They look at the habits of people who successfully maintain weight loss. And breakfast is one of them. Now, I know fasting doesn't always mean that and breakfast are synonymous, but for most part, people end up skipping breakfast when they're doing fasting protocols. Yet we find people who are successful weight loss maintainers eat breakfast. And so a lot of my clients do not have the physique they want, right? That's why they're coming to me. And so there's not many cases where I'm going to go against recommending it. It's not controlling the outcome we want. And then we look at people who are successful at doing what they want, they aren't fasting. So I'm pretty hard pressed to figure out who I would recommend it to. People that are already seeing results with it, but they might not be coming to me, right? Because they're already seeing results. But then, some wacky, or not wacky, difficult travel schedules for eating healthy.
That does make me think, though, there are maybe days or scenarios or very specific short-term contexts where fasting could be an effective strategy. But it's when this is what I do every single day that things seem to fall apart, when it's a default to the day and not like to your point, where like lots of dinners and now I'm on an airplane, whatever it might be, and it's going to be really hard to check both quantity and quality. That's where, if you understand some of the strategies of fasting, you can implement that. But it's when it's brought into, and this is what I do every day, that seems to be the problem.
And again, I think I used the analogy before. I really feel like it's almost backseat driving. You're really getting removed from what are the variables that you want to control. And so that's why I feel like you're exactly right, that if you start using that as your everyday thing, it's just further removed from controlling the variables that control the result.
Got it. Thank you, EC. Thanks everybody out there for listening. Thanks for subscribing to the show wherever you are listening or watching this. EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.